So Respen A, it's a homeopathic disc, and really what it does is it boosts that mitochondrial enzyme MAOA. Some recent news, fairly recent news, autism is just increasing at a tremendous rate. Now the CDC says it's and just within 1 year they went from 1 in 88 to now 1 in 68 children are now being diagnosed with some form of autism spectrum disorder. A recent study showed that that there was an increased risk of autism if the mother used antidepressants during pregnancy. This study actually supports my hypothesis about what's happening with the serotonin building up. It's not being broke down because your antidepressants increase your serotonin levels. So that meant the baby during pregnancy got even higher serotonin levels. If they're having trouble breaking it down, the serotonin got even higher and would cause more of a problem. Then there was another study that showed that there was an increased prevalence in children that were conceived during the winter months. Mm-hmm. So I had to do some research on that. I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder why that is and if that ties to MAOA. Well, they found there is research that shows that your MAOA activity is seasonal. It's greatly decreased in the winter and it's highest during the summer. So that also made sense. Then another study showed there was increased prevalence with maternal obesity, which is also tied to it because MAOA is inhibited by alanine, and alanine production is increased with the size of the girth. So the greater the girth size, the greater the alanine production. So all of these things kind of help support it, gives more supportive evidence that I'm on the right track here with this MAOA. Well, monoamine oxidase A, like I said, the acronym for it is MAOA. There's an MAOA and an MAOB. And, you know, what I couldn't understand is why am I the only one, I can't find any other company looking to increase MAOA activity. And I think the reason that is they kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater, medical research did. They looked at monoamine like I say, there's an MAOA and an MAOB, and it's like a ratio, a teeter-totter in the body. And they looked at, in different disease states, they looked at monoamine oxidase activity. In other words, not depicting whether it was A or whether it was B, just monoamine oxidase as a whole. And they looked at that activity in different disease states, and they found that monoamine oxidase activity was quite high in all these different disease states. And so what they did was they just assumed that monoamine oxidase is bad. And it's a very big oxidizing agent. And so that's kind of where also we associated oxidation with disease, and then we went into this whole antioxidant craze because of this. Well, here's the problem. The studies that they did were on platelets because platelets are easy to access. The problem is platelets are specifically MAOB, not MAOA. So yes, MAOB does go high. What we'll see in these different neurological as well as physical states, disease states, is the MAOA goes down, its activity goes down, and MAOB's activity goes up. It's almost everything that inhibits MAOA boosts MAOB activity. So MAOA, here's the kind of a illustration of the enzyme, and it has 4 active sites on it. 4 sites, active sites, think of them as docking sites. One here is for serotonin to dock up to. One's for norepinephrine to dock up to. One is for histamine to dock up to. And one is for dopamine to dock up to. And once those things dock up to the MAOA, it converts these, like the serotonin, into its active aldehyde, norepinephrine into its active aldehyde, and histamine into its active aldehyde, as well as dopamine. Now, dopamine is more of on the MAOA, it's more of a secondary compensatory type docking site because the majority of your dopamine is metabolized by the MAOB. So what you're going to find with these children is their MAOA activity is low, their MAOB is high. So they're having trouble utilizing their serotonin, their norepinephrine, their histamine, and they're running mostly on dopamine via their MAOB enzyme. So the active aldehyde of serotonin, had it docked up to the MAOA enzyme, would be what we call 5-HIAL, stands for 5-hydroxyindoleacetaldehyde. And it's the functions that it's involved in are mood, your sense of well-being, fine and gross motor movement, sleep, melatonin production, sensory integration, and discrimination. You'll notice that a lot of these children have a lot of problems with, they'll have fine and gross motor movement. Some of them will even walk on their toes. You'll also notice a lot of children, when they go to make a fist, they put their, they tuck their thumb into the fist instead of, that would be like a newborn baby will tuck their thumb into the fist. But once the neurological system is, as it quickly matures, they very quickly start to, just like you do, when you make a fist, your thumb goes on the outside of your fist. A lot of these children won't. They'll tuck their thumb into the fist. They'll also have a lot of them will have little tremors. They don't have really good dexterity. They will, when they write more like a child. If you've never noticed children when they're small, they write very light. They don't press down on the paper when they write. And so a lot of these children, the same thing. They don't press down on the paper. No, that's another function, not just move the hand, but actually create pressure down as well. And so you'll see that they just don't have quite the coordination. Most of them do have sleep problems. Most of them don't, produce melatonin well. And the sensory integration discrimination, a lot of them are hypersensitive. Their skin is hypersensitized. They also can't discriminate, and say, I'm going to pay attention to this, but not this. They can't prioritize in their environment and what stimuli. It's like being overstimulated by all their senses. And then norepinephrine, it gets converted by MAOA into its active aldehyde, which is the acronym is dopagol, stands for dihydroxyphenylglycolaldehyde. And it's involved in focus, concentration, again, fine and gross motor movement, sensory integration, discrimination again, memory, and social recognition memory. And later on in some other webinars we do, I'll talk about how epidurals very much inhibit this norepinephrine thing and this whole social recognition memory thing. They've shown they completely can block that, the ability of a child to retain a facial recognition. And but you'll notice that without dopagol is the one that when you go in to take a test, you kind of got a little adrenaline going, you're going to take a test, and all of a sudden, as you get going into that test, you can shut everything out in the room, not pay attention to anything but that test. You're not even aware of others in your room. You can really focus and concentrate. And you'll notice most of these children have a lot of trouble with that. They cannot focus and stay on task. And you'll also notice that a lot of, as I'm reading these things, a lot of these neurotransmitters, the aldehyde neurotransmitter, their function overlap. So just like the norepinephrine, it's also involved in the fine and gross motor movement and sensory integration and discrimination. Because they overlap, it tells you they should have fired together. And so we'll kind of talk a little bit about why that can also be a problem if they're not firing together. Another, for instance, the histamine should have docked up and become what we call telemethylimidazole acetaldehyde. And that's involved in your gastric acid and digestive enzymes, which most of these children have problems with. They're not making the gastric acid they should. They don't make the digestive enzymes they should. They have poor GI function altogether. They have malabsorption of nutrients, etc. Hypothalamus, it's involved in the hypothalamus, which is really your motherboard for your brain. It's like the circuitry. It's like the old telephone operators. It makes all the connections to all the things. And so without that, working, you really don't make the connection to your prefrontal cortex, where all your executive functioning is happening, and thought processes, and being able to abstract think, etc. It's also involved very much in your thyroid function, your heat stress regulation. You'll find a lot of these children, some of them get so they don't even sweat anymore. They don't tolerate the extreme heat or extreme cold. It's an immune it balances your immune system, balancing your Th1, Th2. Most of these children are becoming what we call Th1 dominant, where causing lots of inflammation, and because it's called what we call cell-mediated inflammation, a lot of cell destruction. The pineal gland stimulation, again, that's where you make your melatonin and stuff. So that's very much involved in that. Then the fourth one, dopamine, which is your, also known as dopal, which is, it's involved in, when you're making a lot of that and running on that, you're going to be very impulsive. You're going to be obsessive, compulsive. You can have a lot, it's also involved in motor movement. You can get a lot of tics. You can be sensory seeking, where you're never satisfied. You're always looking for something bigger. You kind of, and so when you're running on all this dopamine, this dopal, what happens is it keeps stimulating more dopamine, and it's very addictive, and you want more and you want more. So that's why you do the sensory seeking, because you can't get satisfied. What you got to rush from. Is decreased in autism spectrum disorders. And remember, the MAOA converts the serotonin, the histamine, and norepinephrine into their active aldehydes. So if you have decreased MAOA activity, it results in a buildup of the serotonin, which then, as I spoke earlier about, inhibits oxytocin nerve growth. And so then you're going to lose your empathy for others. If you don't have that, if that oxytocin is inhibited because the MAOA is down, you're not going to have empathy for others. You're not going to be really interested in others. You're not going to be very social. You're really you don't have that bonding thing. You're pretty much just, it's all about you type thing. And then deficient MAOA activity also results in the norepinephrine not being converted into its active aldehyde. So most of the norepinephrine is having to go down to epinephrine, which puts a person into fight or flight. And when you're in fight or flight mode, you cannot, it's like all this stimulus is in your face. You can't say, okay, I'm going to put this on the back burner and pay attention to this. I'm going to take all this information in and think about it and rationalize. You can't do that. You are in fight or flight. If you ever saw a person who had just maybe had an accident or something traumatic just all of a sudden happened, prioritize. These children can't do that. And that's why they cannot take that's why they really need structure, lots of structure, because that's a way of they've been able to cope like this. All this is in my face, but if I just follow the structure, that's why they'll also become very OCD. They've got to stay in, they've got to have these routines, and what it is actually a coping mechanism. So here's kind of a visual of what happens. So A plus B plus C equals D. So what we want to get to is D. We want to make that active aldehyde. So, and in this example, I'm using the serotonin. It's the same thing as for norepinephrine. It's the same thing for histamine. Just they different docking sites, but same kind of a process. We need that active aldehyde to be made so that we can actually utilize that neurotransmitter. So the serotonin, we make the serotonin from L-tryptophan or 5-H. Well, we get L-tryptophan like from our meat, and then we convert that into 5-HTP, 5-hydroxytryptophan. And then that then gets converted into serotonin, which is 5-HT. So that serotonin is made and then it's stored in these vesicles in the cell. Now, it would just stay in those vesicles unless you stimulate it to be released. And so a lot of things that cause big stimulators of serotonin to be released from those vesicles, where's my little arrow, from those vesicles out into the synapse, right here, this gap between nerve, or what stimulates that release of serotonin into that synapse so it can go across and stimulate the next nerve or the muscle or whatever is inositol or gluten. And this is why, for instance, in depression, people don't, again, they aren't able to utilize their serotonin. It's not a case that the serotonin is low. It's a case that the serotonin is not being utilized. It's not being converted into its active aldehyde by MAOA. And so you'll see people like with depression, they'll crave foods that are high in gluten, your comfort foods, your cakes, your cookies, those kind of things. Because it's kind of a way of the body trying to self-medicate and saying, hey, I don't have enough of this aldehyde, so release more serotonin. Maybe I can get it converted. And so anyway, this is also why a lot of these children have benefited from the gluten-free diet, because gluten is a very big stimulator of the release of serotonin, especially in the gut. And the gut is is a very big producer of serotonin. The gut and the brain are the biggest producers. So, a child who already has too much serotonin, it's building up, he can't break it down into its active aldehyde. To give him gluten is just going to make it worse. You're just going to release more serotonin into that synapse and have it build up and start shutting things down, such as the oxytocin. So this is why they have done well without the gluten. The homeopathic dilution of Respen, which, by the way, don't confuse that with risperidol. It is not risperidol. It's not anything like risperidol, but a lot of people think it is. But because of the names, it looks familiar. Similar. But Respen, and Respen has been shown to double the activity of MAOA within 72 hours of the first dose. That's what we really kind of see. When we give Respen, a lot of people, as long as you haven't been on any of the supplements that can interfere with Respen, we don't have to clear those from your system, a lot of times you'll see that these, within the same day. In fact, I've had parents call back and say, I'm a little leery. I'm seeing this, but is it just hopeful thinking, or is it just placebo or whatever? Well, first off, placebo really doesn't do much on these children. So there isn't much to have a placebo effect on them. But anyway, don't be surprised if you see it with just in a few hours of putting it on, a difference. Because you're activating that MAOA, and very quickly those neurons start firing together like they're supposed to. So Respen is a homeopathic disc. It comes to you in these foil packets. We have to protect it. We had the hardest time stabilizing the Respen. Respen used to require refrigeration, very strict refrigeration. Had to be shipped on ice, next day air, all that stuff. And but that was when it still had some molecules of Respen in it. Respen is not a stable molecule. And so I worked to try and get it so it was stable at room temperature. And I knew if I could get rid of those molecules, that I could make it stable at room temperature. But every time I tried to get it out to just what we call a 12C dilution, homeopathic dilution, get it out to all those serial dilutions, it failed. It didn't work. Well, the reason is the Respen was breaking down on us as we were making those serial dilutions because it's not stable. And so by the time I got out to a 12C dilution, I had the frequency off of one of its degradation products, not off of Respen per se. So I finally learned how to do that. We finally developed the technique of how to do that, keep it stable. So now it does not require refrigeration. You can just put it in your purse, travel with it like that. It can be just shipped regular mail. The disc will melt. This is the little disc that's in that foil packet. This little disc is kind
kind of reminds me of a gummy bear type texture. It's kind of sticky on both sides, real soft. So if you leave it in a hot car or something, it would melt. So you wouldn't want to do that. I actually do store it in the refrigerator because it makes the disc a little bit harder and less sticky. When you get the disc out of this foil packet, it's going to be sandwiched between two pieces of freezer paper. And you got to peel that paper off of both sides, and it's easier to peel that paper off the disc if it's cold versus if it's at room temperature. So then you put the disc. Some people like to put the disc on the patch, on the sticky side of the patch first, and stick the whole thing on. I don't. I put the disc on the skin. It'll stick kind of to the skin like this, kind of sticky. And you put it somewhere on the torso of the body. It can be the abdomen, the back, the hip, the side. Some children who won't wear a patch or keep a Band-Aid on, you can put it between the shoulder blades. And then you cover it with this little adhesive patch that comes to seal it tight to the skin. You have to seal it tight to the skin. You cannot, if it evaporates, you lose your evaporation, you'll lose the frequency that's in there. So you have to seal it tight. That's why it has to come sealed in foil. Some children, maybe you'll find, it's a little strong for them. We need to cut the dose a little bit. So you can actually cut this disc with the scissors to cut it in half. What you're doing is halving the amplitude and of the frequency. And so, but unfortunately though, you can't keep the other half because there's no way to seal this again tight in this foil so you don't get the evaporation and lose it. So unfortunately, you'll just have to discard the other half if you found your child will need half a disc or whatever. There are certain supplements that are needed when using the Respen. Calcium is an absolute must. If your child isn't getting adequate calcium absorption or taking the calcium that is needed to be, you're going to see aggression and irritability. And then if you see that, you would switch to a different form of calcium. The calcium the pharmacy sends with the first dose of Respen, they send it free of charge, so we don't know what calcium is going to be best for your child, but most children do best with the calcium carbonate. The reason being is because the MAOA not working like it's supposed to, the mitochondria is not working like it's supposed to, so they're producing a lot of lactic acid, their body is. That makes them very acidic. And so calcium carbonate, being an alkaline product, we find works best for most of these children. But there have been some children that need the calcium citrate. Not very many, especially children who are on an alkalinizing diet or children who are using like bile salts or something like that, they've needed the calcium citrate. But you'll just know, you'll start on the Respen with the calcium that the pharmacy tells you to do. You take all 2,000 milligrams at once with breakfast. And it very quickly, or let's say your child does really well for like the first week or so, and then they start to see this aggression and irritability. Well, it tells us they're not absorbing enough calcium. And they started out with too high a calcium because of what was happening with mitochondria. Their calcium influx into their cells is too high. And the reason that is when you make a lot of lactic acid, we pull calcium phosphate out of our bones. And the phosphate breaks away from the calcium and goes and neutralizes the acid and leaves you with all this free, unbound calcium. That free, unbound calcium goes into the cells and stimulates them and makes them become very, just stimulates a lot of cell division, a lot of cell destruction, inflammation. It goes into your mast cells, which are your gut's lined with lots of mast cells. Every nerve ending has a mast cell. Your lungs are full of mast cells. Your skin's full of mast cells. And consequently, that calcium goes into those mast cells and just makes them become neurotic. So that's why you'll see these behavior problems and all these food sensitivities and chemical sensitivities to these children. And you might see a lot of times they'll have eczema, on their skin and all these things. Is because of this calcium going into those mast cells and causing them to just become neurotic. So for instance, in the gut, it goes into those mast cells, makes them become hypersensitive. And so then when they eat casein, for instance, a protein that is not normal in our body, And normally a mast cell in the gut that wasn't hypersensitized by the calcium would recognize the casein as, you're not a threat, no big deal, go ahead, go on through. Whereas a mast cell that's now become just neurotic and hypersensitized by all this calcium coming into it, it comes in contact with casein, and it goes, oh my gosh, you don't belong in the body, and it stimulates a whole immune response, an inflammatory response. Which really ends up, a lot of people are diagnosed with pandas and stuff like that, and it's really from this. It's this whole hyper inflammatory immune response that's going on in the gut because of this. And we find you just start them on the Respen, you get the mitochondria settled down, you stop getting that calcium influx in, and very quickly they just settle out. So you might be asking yourself, but wait a minute, you're saying we want to get that calcium down, but you're giving 2,000 milligrams of calcium. Well, that's because resurfacing has been shown to almost completely abolish the ability of calcium to go into the cells. And which is a good thing, because we got too much calcium going into these cells in these children, but they still need some calcium to go into the cells. You need a normal level of it to go in, because calcium in and of itself is a neurotransmitter. So consequently, we have to give 2,000 milligrams all at once with breakfast just to have that normal level of calcium going into the cells. Do not use, and like I say, we find calcium carbonate to be the best for most children. Although oyster shell calcium and coral calcium is a calcium carbonate, do not use those. They do not work. In fact, research has shown that the way the calcium is bound into the matrix of the shell or the coral, we can't utilize it. We can't break it out of there to utilize it. So don't use those. If you're changing to calcium citrate, so let's say you change to calcium citrate and it doesn't resolve the aggression and irritability, maybe they're just having trouble completely absorbing calcium. Calcium is not we don't absorb calcium readily. Calcium is we only absorb about 4 to 15% of what we take in. So maybe the way binders in the tablet they're taking, maybe that's interfering. Maybe the liquid would work better. Well, I'll tell you another thing that really works to help to increase calcium absorption. It's the prebiotic FOS. FOS stands for fructooligosaccharides, and it has a lot of health benefits for us. It's very good. It's the best thing I've ever found to combat yeast, candida. And the reason is yeast, candida, is a very opportunistic organism. It has become very resistant to any of our antifungals. And so what happens is the only really good, effective way to battle yeast anymore is through competition. And one of the beauties, there are different prebiotics, but the one I could find all the research on, and the one that seems to be superior, is FOS. And they even showed that FOS will, if you've got two different bacterial cells, and you gave it you gave it everything it needed. You gave it its optimal food, and you took away its waste. Within a 24-hour period, it would create the mass of an aircraft carrier. Well, if you're given millions of these bacteria a day on a daily basis in these probiotics, you can imagine. So what they've actually shown is prebiotics. The reason they're not taking hold, these probiotics really aren't doing much, is because our diets don't have the optimal food anymore. A soluble fiber is what we need, and we don't have much soluble fiber anymore in our diets. Gelatin is a wonderful soluble fiber. So what FOS is, it's in a lot of our natural foods. It's in oatmeal. I think it might be in bananas. I can't remember. It's in onions, numerous things. But the beauty of FOS is we can't digest it, even though it's a saccharide, a sugar. We can't digest it, but it's the optimal food of our good bacteria. It's similar to the the agar that you would grow in a petri dish to grow bacteria. And so as the bacteria utilize that FOS for their food, they get the upper hand on yeast, and they start through competition pushing out the yeast and keeping the yeast in control. But also, as the bacteria utilizes that FOS, the bacteria produces a protein, a waste protein, which that protein then, if you get that protein in the right concentration, certain concentration rate, it will stimulate our body to produce two very important calcium binding proteins. One is called calbinin D9K, and one is called calbinin D28K.